In the spring of 1873, starvation had drained all compassion from the earth. A woman named Melina Gracewood, daughter of settlers who once held their heads high, found herself lashed to a rotting wooden post at the border of an abandoned meadow. The rope had torn into her wrists until they bled, and her lips had split from days without water. Yet nothing wounded her as deeply as watching her 4 children waste away before her eyes. Their small frames reduced to skin stretched over bone, their gazes empty and dark. 3 days had passed since their last meal. The young ones held each other close, seeking warmth as the cool spring breeze swept dust across the barren landscape. Her husband's relatives lounged near their covered wagon, their expressions hardened by selfishness, mumbling about how things might improve if there were fewer people to feed. When she'd pleaded for even a scrap of food, they'd responded with restraints and cruelty. "Please, take my children rather than me," her voice rasped into the empty air, though none of them bothered to acknowledge her words. Her plea splintered like brittle wood breaking. She was prepared to fade away completely if it meant her little ones might survive. In the stillness afterward, only a bird's sharp call seemed to taunt her anguish. Then, cutting through the distance, came the rhythmic sound of a horse approaching, steady as death itself. A horseman appeared over the gentle rise, his form outlined against the pale, washed-out sky. Even seated in his saddle, his height was obvious, his wide shoulders draped in a dark coat, his hat casting shadows across features that had grown accustomed to keeping silent. This was Richard Boone, recognized throughout the area as a wealthy man who preferred isolation. He'd lost his own wife 3 years earlier and rarely spoke after that. People claimed he valued quietness above friendship, property above joy. Yet that morning, something guided his mount toward the broken woman and the 4 dying children beside her. Richard pulled his horse to a stop several yards away, the animal snorting through the dust. His eyes took in the rope cutting into her flesh, the sharp angles of her ribs visible beneath her worn cotton dress, the fierce determination in her oldest son's stanza, boy, barely 10 years old. Positioning his fragile body as a shield between the world and his younger siblings. The relatives turned with sneering expressions. "Keep riding," Boone once shouted, his tone dripping with scorn. "This family matter doesn't concern you." Richard offered no response. His wordlessness carried more force than any angry outburst could have managed. His attention shifted from Melina's shaking hands to the distended bellies of the starving children. Then, moving deliberately, he dismounted from his saddle. Dust billowed around his boots as they hit the ground. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Another man mocked, his fingers hovering near the blade at his waist. Richard approached without rushing, the leather of his gloves making faint sounds as he retrieved his knife. He noticed the flash of fear crossing their faces. Though he wasn't one to seek confrontation, everyone nearby understood he possessed a restrained type of threat, the kind that never needed announcing. With a single decisive cut, he sliced through the bindings. Melina lurched forward, lacking the strength to remain standing. He grabbed her arm just before she collapsed, his hold firm, his face revealing nothing. The children swarmed around her, gripping her worn dress, their eyes shifting nervously between him and the relatives who'd forsaken them. The in-laws hurled insults, warning he'd live to regret his interference. "That woman will destroy your reputation, Boone. Everyone will mock you." Richard remained silent. He simply crouched down, scooped up the youngest child, and motioned for the rest to come along. He led Melina toward his horse as though their verbal assault couldn't reach him. She stumbled, partially supported by him, partially dragging herself forward, till he carefully settled her onto the saddle. The children gathered around his legs, staring upward with a gratitude too exhausted to express in words. He mounted behind her, pulling her against him to keep her secure. With the children clustered nearby, the small group departed, abandoning the relatives to shout at the indifferent wind. Melina never glanced backward. She sensed Richard's silent strength at her back. Powerful as an oath, he'd never been asked to swear. When afternoon arrived, they reached his property, a sprawling area of aged timber buildings and peaceful fields, extending toward the distant edge of the world. It wasn't magnificent, but after the wasteland of hopelessness she'd endured, it appeared like a sanctuary. Richard climbed down, lowered her with unexpected tenderness, then attended to the children. He pushed open the door without speaking. They entered as if crossing into something impossible. The faint but genuine aroma of baked bread hung in the air. Richard worked with deliberate efficiency, placing cookware on the stove, spooning hot stew into worn bowls. The children consumed the meal hungrily, their utensils clinking, their narrow shoulders shuddering with gratitude. Melina remained separate, her hands clasped together, embarrassment heating her face as if she'd taken something unearned. When Richard placed a bowl in front of her, she attempted to decline. "Please, feed the children first." He met her eyes briefly, then nudged the bowl nearer. His silence wasn't harsh. It was solid, like bedrock beneath her. She complied, consuming slowly, each mouthful simultaneously a blessing and an injury to her dignity. Later, as dusk colored the horizon in delicate shades of pink and silver, Melina gathered the children near the fireplace. Richard observed from the threshold, his hat held in his hands. He could detect the distant laughter of his neighbors carried on the breeze, despite their being miles distant. He already anticipated what the community would declare, that he'd abandoned good sense, that no prosperous man should attach himself to a destitute widow with 4 dependents. But judgmental gossip had never influenced his decisions before, and it wouldn't begin now. The following days progressed peacefully, though each brought the sharp edge of rumors. Throughout town, men expelled tobacco juice and grumbled that Boone had imprisoned himself in hardship. Women pulled their wraps tighter when Melina walked past, their looks cutting like blades. She endured it with downcast eyes, cleaning Richard's home, repairing his garments, instructing her young ones to offer quiet thanks at his table. Every action was a humble tribute, though she remained convinced she was still an unwanted presence under his roof. One night, as spring settled over the countryside, rainfall pounded the rooftop and gusts battered the wooden shutters. Melina knelt beside the hearth, encouraging flames to life with work-roughened hands. Her children rested together beneath stitched blankets. The tempest rumbled, lightning illuminating the space in brief, brilliant flashes. Richard entered from the downpour, his coat soaked, his hat obscuring his features. He stopped, observing her crouched silhouette lit by the fire's warm glow. She looked up, surprised, and for an instant time seemed suspended. Thunder echoed outside the walls. But in the narrow distance between them existed a silence more meaningful than language. For the first time, Melina experienced his gaze upon her not as criticism, but as something more profound, more constant and impossible to articulate. Embarrassment battled with a delicate warmth rising in her chest. Her breathing faltered, her hands froze above the hearth. He uttered nothing. He simply observed, as if committing her image to memory, vulnerable, yet undefeated. A woman constrained not by rope, but by society's condemnation, and still upright. Lightning blazed again, brilliant against the storm-lashed window. And in that fleeting illumination, their eyes connected without defense. Something wordless transferred between them, delicate and perilous a commitment neither dared articulate. Then the thunder consumed the instant completely, leaving only rainfall, firelight, and the weighty reality that the frontier itself would soon oppose them. The storm subsided, but the impression of his gaze remained like smoke after flames. Melina awakened to the quiet of morning sunshine spreading across the wooden floor, the atmosphere still moist with rain scent. Her children shifted beside her, their expressions gentler now that rest and nourishment had diminished some of their deprivation. She stood quietly, tidying the space, pressing her palm to her chest as though settling the untamed beating of a heart that no longer belonged solely to her. Richard was already outdoors, repairing a broken fence section, his solid form working with a consistency that rendered the world less harsh. She brought water to him without prompting. When their fingers touched over the bucket's wooden grip, she averted her eyes, face flushing. He spoke nothing, yet she sensed the substance of his silence enveloping her like protective covering, simultaneously shield and inquiry. But the world surrounding his property wasn't quiet. Whispers crept through town like drifting smoke. The tavern buzzed with ridicule at his cost. Boone's transformed his place into a charity house, one patron mocked, striking his glass against the bar. For brats and their begging mother, he'll suffocate under their need. Women shook their heads disapprovingly when Melina passed carrying her basket. No shame at all, they whispered, despite her modest clothing and lowered gaze. She absorbed the condemnation as she'd absorbed hunger previously. But the children overheard, and humiliation entered their words. One evening, her oldest inquired, "Mother, are we a weight upon him?" She couldn't respond, merely pressed her lips against his hair, her tears concealed in the strands. Richard heard the talk too. He stood inside the general store, loading a sack with dried beans, when another rancher spoke loudly enough to wound. Boone's abandoned reason completely. Poor fool, he's nourishing a crowd of mouths that aren't his responsibility. Richard's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. He transported the sack outside, placed it carefully into the wagon where Melina waited, and directed the reins homeward, without acknowledgment or remark. Yet within his chest, something ancient and unspoken awakened. A refusal to permit shame to determine the value of his decision. Spring intensified. Greenery emerging through the earth like hope, challenging the sky. Melina cultivated a modest garden behind the dwelling, her fingers working the soil. The children giggling as they planted seeds in neat lines. Richard stood observing, his hat brim low against the brightness. Eventually, he removed his gloves, knelt beside her, and covered the seeds with his own weathered hands. The moment was simply earth and breathing. Yet it bore the significance of a pledge, something established and lasting. She glanced up momentarily, startled, and discovered his eyes not stern, but softened by the proximity of life emerging in both ground and spirit. The tranquility proved temporary. One afternoon, the rattling of wagon wheels approached the pathway, harsh against the stillness. Melina froze, her sewing needle suspended above the fabric she was mending. Outside, voices erupted, rough and recognizable. Richard stepped onto the porch, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. Confronting the wagon carrying her in-laws, they descended with arrogance, eyes cruel with avarice. "We've arrived for the children," one announced harshly. "They aren't yours to keep. Family ties cannot be broken." The children clung to their mother, fear blooming in their expressions. Melina's body trembled, her arms encircling them as though she could protect them from everything. Richard's hand moved near his waist where his revolver hung. He didn't draw it. His voice, when it emerged, was quiet, controlled, forged from granite. "This is their home now." The men bristled, voicing threats, their hands twitching near their weapons. For a heartbeat, the atmosphere was metallic, the silence of the plains heavier than gunshots. Then one expelled saliva into the dirt and withdrew. "You'll live to regret this, Boone. The community will never pardon you." The wagon departed, leaving dust trailing behind, but the memory of danger persisted long afterward. That evening, Melina sat stitching by lamplight, her children sleeping in a cluster. Richard entered softly, placing a coffee cup beside her. She jumped, then whispered, "I possess nothing to offer you, only additional mouths, additional shame." The lamp's glow caught the exhausted lines of her face, the trembling of her fingers. Richard regarded her for an extended moment, then wordlessly allowed a slight smile to ease his features. It was subtle, but it demolished the chains surrounding her heart. Tears traced down her cheeks. Falling silently onto the cloth in her lap, days transformed into weeks, and the community's whispers intensified into weapons. Yet Richard didn't yield. He walked alongside Melina in the marketplace, carried her packages, lifted her children onto his wagon without embarrassment. Each action was quiet resistance. Eventually, even the gossip began to weaken, though the stares persisted. Melina discovered how to raise her head somewhat higher, not in arrogance, but in reclaimed self-worth. Her children laughed more frequently, their voices echoing across the ranch like chimes. Then arrived the day when the church bell rang for a wedding ceremony, and the benches filled with inquisitive onlookers. The minister stood at the altar waiting. Richard, dressed simply but neatly, stood upright, his expression serious. Beside him, Melina advanced in a plain repaired dress, a ribbon woven into her hair by her daughter's fingers. The murmurs rippled through the room. He's actually marrying her with 4 children already. But the muttering couldn't stop the cadence of her footsteps. Her children stood at her side, their eyes brilliant with a pride that no starvation could ever diminish. When the promises were exchanged, Richard's voice was unwavering, unashamed. He clasped her hand, and in that grip existed all the words he'd never articulated, the promise of protection, honor, and a space where affection could flourish unseen by the world's harshness. Melina's voice wavered as she responded, but her eyes gleamed, and in that instant, she was no longer the starving woman bound to a post. She was a bride restored not through riches, but through dignity. Standing unbent against the frontier's judgment, the final benediction settled quietly in the atmosphere, but its resonance rang in the hearts of those observing. Richard kissed her gently, and her children applauded with delight, their laughter silencing every whisper. The West could criticize, could condemn, but it couldn't erase what had been built between 2 souls who possessed nothing yet discovered everything. As they exited the church into the sunshine, the townspeople separated, some reluctant, some softened, all witnesses to a union they hadn't believed achievable. Richard guided Melina forward with a hand supporting her back, steady and certain. She gazed up at him, her heart overflowing with an affection she'd never dared. Imagine a love created not from dramatic displays, but from silence, faithfulness, and endurance. And as the children raced ahead, their laughter streaming like ribbons through the air, the narrator's voice rose gently, as though emerging from the dust and the ages. In a frontier where wealth mattered more than compassion, one man selected silence over crowds, and one woman selected belief over defeat. Together they built a home where disgrace was buried and affection flourished in once barren ground. Remember this, friend? Self-respect isn't granted by society, but won quietly through the bravery of 2 souls who face it together. Now select the story awaiting you on your screen. It holds a truth even more powerful than this tale, and it might transform how you perceive the world. Go ahead. Don't allow it to slip away.